The summer morning air hung thick with dust and diesel fumes as Hauptmann Friedrich Weber positioned his 6th Panzer Division reconnaissance unit along the tree line near Orsha, western Russia. It was early July 1941, barely 2 weeks into Operation Barbarossa, and the Wehrmacht's advance seemed unstoppable. Weber's veterans had crushed Polish cavalry, swept through France, and now they were carving through Soviet defenses like a hot knife through butter. Through his Zeiss binoculars, Weber watched a column of Soviet trucks retreating in disarray down the Smolensk highway. Standard chaos, standard victory. His radio man was already calling in artillery coordinates when something caught his attention. Several trucks had stopped and were deploying something. Strange rail-like structures were tilting skyward from the truck beds. "What are those?" his gunner asked, squinting through the morning haze. Weber didn't answer. He was watching Soviet soldiers running away from their own vehicles, sprinting for cover with an urgency that seemed excessive even for troops under fire. The trucks sat there, abandoned, their strange metal frameworks pointing at the sky like skeletal fingers. Then the world ended. What Hauptmann Weber witnessed in the next 10 seconds would haunt German soldiers for the rest of the war. 16 trails of fire erupted simultaneously from each truck, the rockets screaming off their rails with a sound unlike anything in the Wehrmacht's experience. Not the whistle of artillery shells, not the drone of dive bombers. This was different. This was a howling, shrieking chorus that seemed to tear the air itself apart. The Germans who survived called it Stalin-Orgel, Stalin's organ. The name wasn't meant as a compliment. It was spoken in hushed tones in field hospitals, whispered around campfires, muttered by shell-shocked soldiers who had watched entire companies disappear in seconds beneath a storm of fire that seemed to come from hell itself. Weber's position ceased to exist. The rockets, each carrying 48 pounds of high explosive, saturated a rectangular area the size of several football fields. Trees became splinters, vehicles became shrapnel, men became memories. Weber survived only because he'd been standing slightly behind a stone barn when the barrage hit. When the smoke cleared, he was the only man from his 20-soldier unit still breathing. The weapon that had just destroyed his command was the BM-13, known universally by its diminutive nickname, Katya, or Little Katie. The name came from a popular Soviet love song, a gentle ballad about a girl waiting for her soldier to return home. The irony was lost on no one. This Little Katie was the most concentrated expression of industrial death the world had yet seen. The Katyusha wasn't born from brilliant strategic planning or years of careful military doctrine. It was born from desperation, from the frantic scramble of a nation that knew war was coming and knew it wasn't ready. In 1938, Soviet engineer Georgy Longomak had been working on rocket artillery at the Reactive Scientific Research Institute in Moscow. Rockets weren't new. The British had used them against Napoleon, the Chinese had experimented with them for centuries. But nobody had figured out how to make them practical, accurate, or reliable enough for modern warfare. Rockets were notoriously unstable, wildly inaccurate, and prone to exploding on their own launchers. Longomak didn't live to see his creation unleashed. He was arrested during Stalin's purges in 1937, accused of being a German spy, and executed in 1938. The cruel absurdity was that the weapon he'd helped develop would become one of Germany's worst nightmares. The project was salvaged by Andrei Kostakov, who took credit for Longomak's work, and by a team of engineers who understood that the Soviet Union didn't need precision. It needed volume. It needed terror. It needed a weapon that could be mass-produced by factories that were still learning how to make tractors. The breakthrough came with the RS-132 rocket, originally designed for aircraft. Someone
history doesn't record who, had the idea of mounting these rockets on trucks. Not complicated vehicles, not specialized military hardware, just ordinary Studebaker and Zis-6 trucks with metal rails welded to the bed. The beauty of the design was its brutal simplicity. 16 rails, angled at 45 degrees. 16 rockets, 132 millimeters in diameter, 6 feet long, loaded with explosives. An electrical firing system that could launch all 16 in 10 seconds. No complex aiming mechanisms, no sophisticated fire control systems. Just point the truck in the general direction of the enemy and unleash hell. The first battery of 7 BM-13 launchers was formed under absolute secrecy in June 1941. The crews were sworn to silence on pain of death. If a launcher was in danger of capture, they were ordered to destroy it completely. Stalin wasn't worried about the Germans copying the design. He was worried about them understanding just how simple it was. Captain Ivan Flyorov commanded this first battery. He was 36 years old, a veteran artilleryman who'd been pulled from conventional forces and told he was being given a weapon that would change the war. When he saw the Katyusha for the first time, he wasn't sure whether to laugh or cry. It looked like something assembled in a collective farm workshop.
July 14, 1941. The German 6th and 8th Panzer Divisions were converging on the railway station at Orsha, a critical junction for Soviet supply lines. The Wehrmacht was days away from encircling 3 Soviet armies. The situation was desperate. Flyorov's battery rolled into position in the late afternoon. His crews deployed the 7 launchers in a clearing, aimed them at the German concentration point, and waited for nightfall. The crews were terrified. They had trained for exactly 2 weeks. Nobody knew if the launchers would work as designed, or if they'd explode and kill everyone nearby. At 1540 hours, Flyorov gave the order. 40 seconds later, 112 rockets had been fired. The German position at Orsha railway station simply disappeared. Ammunition dumps exploded in chain reactions. Fuel trucks became fireballs. The characteristic screaming sound of the rockets sent German soldiers diving for any cover they could find, but there was no cover adequate for what was falling on them. Oberst Heinrich Eberbach, commanding elements of the 6th Panzer Division, later wrote in his after-action report, "The bombardment appeared to come from nowhere, no preliminary ranging shots, no warning, just a sudden storm of explosions that walked across our position like the footsteps of an angry god. In my 20 years of military service, I had never witnessed such concentrated firepower delivered so rapidly." The psychological effect exceeded even the physical destruction. German soldiers who survived Katyusha attacks reported nightmares about the sound, that distinctive howling shriek. It wasn't the clean whistle of incoming artillery. It was something primordial, something that bypassed rational thought and struck directly at the lizard brain's panic centers. Wehrmacht field reports from July and August 1941 show a pattern of escalating concern. Initially, encounters with Katyushas were treated as isolated incidents, probably involving captured German Nebelwerfer rocket launchers. By September, the reports were frantic. This was something new, something the Germans hadn't prepared for, something they didn't know how to counter.
The Katyusha succeeded because it embraced its own limitations. Soviet engineers understood they couldn't build precision weapons at the speed and scale required, so they built volume weapons instead. A single BM-13 launcher could saturate an area of approximately 100,000 square meters in less than 10 seconds. For comparison, a battery of conventional 122mm howitzers needed several minutes of sustained fire to achieve similar coverage. And conventional artillery required trained crews, complex fire direction, ammunition that needed to be individually loaded and aimed. The Katyusha required a driver and 2 or 3 crew members who needed to know how to connect electrical wires and duck. That was it. Training time for a Katyusha crew was measured in days. Training time for a conventional artillery crew was measured in months. The rockets themselves were crude by Western standards. The 132mm M13 rocket used a solid fuel mixture of nitrocellulose and nitroglycerin. Stabilization came from simple fins at the base. Accuracy was approximate. A Katyusha rocket fired at a target 3,000 meters away might land anywhere within a 100-meter radius of the aim point. This didn't matter. The Katyusha wasn't designed to hit a specific tank or bunker. It was designed to obliterate everything within a target zone. It was area denial through overwhelming firepower. The warhead contained 4.9 kilograms of TNT in the standard high-explosive version. Later versions included incendiary compounds, fragmenting sleeves, and shaped-charge anti-armor designs. The explosion from a direct hit could flip a Panzer IV tank. A near miss could shred infantry in the open or collapse wooden structures. But the real weapon wasn't the explosive. It was the sound. Every nation's artillery has a distinctive acoustic signature. Soldiers learn to identify incoming fire by sound, a skill that can mean the difference between diving for cover or standing in the wrong place when 155mm rounds arrive. The Katyusha's sound was unique and uniquely terrifying. The rocket's solid fuel burned unevenly as they flew, creating a fluctuating pitch that human ears interpreted as a scream or wail. Some German soldiers compared it to a woman screaming. Others said it sounded like demons. Soviet troops, who loved the weapon, called it the singing death. The psychological research done after the war confirmed what soldiers had known instinctively. Certain sounds trigger hardwired fear responses in humans. The Katyusha's scream hit several of these triggers simultaneously. Variable pitch, high frequency, sudden onset. The sound alone could break unit cohesion before the first rocket landed.
By August 1941, the Soviet industrial evacuation was in full swing. Entire factories were being disassembled and shipped east, away from the German advance. Machine tools loaded onto trains in Moscow were cutting metal parts in the Urals 3 weeks later. The Katyusha was perfect for this chaotic industrial environment. It didn't require specialized manufacturing equipment. The rails were basic steel fabrication. The rockets used simple sheet metal bodies. The trucks were whatever could be found. American Studebakers from Lend-Lease, Soviet Zis-6s, captured German vehicles, anything with wheels and an engine. The compressor factory in Moscow, which normally built industrial refrigeration equipment, was converted to Katyusha production in September 1941. While German artillery was shelling the city suburbs, workers assembled launchers while air raid sirens wailed overhead. Quality control meant checking if the electrical connections worked. If the launcher could fire without exploding, it went to the front. Production numbers tell the story of Soviet industrial mobilization. In 1941, 593 Katyusha launchers were produced. In 1942, 3,374. In 1943, 3,845. By 1945, the Red Army had over 10,000 launchers in service, and factories were producing them faster than crews could be trained. Each launcher cost approximately 10,000 rubles to produce, roughly the same as a decent truck, because it essentially was a decent truck with metal rails welded on. By contrast, a 122mm M30 howitzer cost 85,000 rubles. A T-34 tank cost 193,000 rubles. The ammunition was even cheaper. A single M13 rocket cost about 600 rubles to produce. For the cost of one tank, Soviet factories could produce thousands of rockets. The mathematics of industrial warfare were brutally simple. Germany could build quality. The Soviet Union could build quantity that overwhelmed quality through sheer volume.
American journalist Alexander Worth, embedded with Soviet forces in 1943, watched a Katyusha battery being assembled at a railway depot. He noted workers who couldn't read instructions, using picture guides to bolt rails onto truck beds. The launchers worked anyway. The genius of the Katyusha, one Soviet engineer told him, is that it was designed to be built by people who had never built anything complicated before. A farmer could assemble it, a teenager could fire it, and it could destroy the most sophisticated army in the world.
The Wehrmacht's initial response to Katyusha attacks was confusion, then fear, then desperate attempts to develop countermeasures. German intelligence worked frantically to capture an intact launcher. The first success came in August 1941, when a BM-13 was abandoned by its crew after mechanical failure. The German engineers who examined it were puzzled. Where was the sophisticated aiming mechanism? Where was the fire control computer? How did the Soviets achieve such devastating effect with such primitive technology? The answer was uncomfortable. They saturated the target area with so many rockets that precision didn't matter. It was the antithesis of German military doctrine, which emphasized accurate fire and ammunition conservation. The Katyusha wasted ammunition by design, firing huge salvos that guaranteed some percentage would hit something important. Field Marshal Gunther von Klug, commanding Army Group Center, ordered his artillery commanders to develop similar weapons. German industry produced the 15-centimeter Panzerwerfer 42, mounting 10 rocket launchers on a modified half-track. It was more sophisticated than the Katyusha, with better accuracy and armor protection for the crew. It was also more expensive, harder to build, and available in much smaller numbers. By the time the Panzerwerfer reached the front in significant quantities, the Red Army had thousands of Katyushas. Germany had built quality. The Soviet Union had built an avalanche. The primary German counter-tactic became hunting Katyusha batteries before they could fire. This was difficult because Soviet doctrine called for shoot-and-scoot operations. A Katyusha battery would roll into position, fire its salvo in under a minute, and be gone before German counter-battery fire arrived. Luftwaffe reconnaissance focused on spotting the distinctive truck-mounted launchers, but this became increasingly difficult as Soviet air defenses strengthened. The Germans who got close enough to see a Katyusha battery deploying rarely survived to report it. Lieutenant Hans Schmidt, a forward artillery observer with the Fourth Army, managed to call in an airstrike on a Katyusha position in November 1941. His report noted that even after destroying the launchers, his unit remained pinned down for 2 hours because Soviet infantry had moved up during the chaos. The rockets aren't just weapons, Schmidt wrote in his diary. They're tactical anchors. Once the Katyushas fire, Soviet forces attack while we're still trying to reorganize. By the time we recover, they've taken the position. We lose not because they destroy us, but because they disorder us at the critical moment.
Soviet propaganda seized on the Katyusha immediately. The weapon had everything the regime needed. It was Soviet-designed, it was devastating to the enemy, and it could be presented as proof of socialist industrial superiority. Katyusha songs proliferated, modifying the original love ballad to celebrate the rocket launcher. Soldiers wrote verses about little Katie bringing death to fascists. Artists painted heroic depictions of launchers firing against dramatic backdrops. The weapon became a symbol of Soviet resistance. The reality was messier and more impressive than the propaganda. Katyusha crews were often women, teenagers, or men rejected for frontline infantry service due to age or minor disabilities. The launcher didn't require physical strength, it required basic mechanical aptitude and courage.
Sergeant Yekaterina Mikhailova commanded a Katyusha battery in the defense of Stalingrad. Her crew consisted of 3 teenage girls and 2 men over 50. In October 1942, her battery fired 384 rockets into German positions in the factory district, then evacuated under direct machine gun fire. 2 crew members were wounded. They reloaded and fired again 3 hours later from a different position. The fascists called it Stalin's organ, Mikhailova recalled in a post-war interview. I think they meant it as an insult, but we loved the name. An organ plays music. We played the music of their destruction. The psychological effect on Soviet morale was almost as important as the physical effect on German forces. After months of devastating defeats, the Red Army finally had a weapon that made the Germans afraid. When Katyushas fired, Soviet infantry could hear the impact of their own artillery overwhelming the enemy. That sound of one's own side unleashing apocalyptic firepower does wonders for morale.
The basic BM-13 design spawned dozens of variants. The BM-8 mounted smaller 82mm rockets, 48 of them on a single launcher. The BM-31 fired massive 300mm rockets, each weighing 206 pounds and capable of demolishing reinforced bunkers. Some versions were mounted on T-34 tank chassis for better armor protection. Others were fitted to railway cars, boats, even horse-drawn carts in desperate situations. Soviet engineers experimented constantly. They developed rockets with delayed fuses that burrowed into buildings before exploding, incendiary versions that scattered burning thermite across defensive positions, fragmenting warheads that turned each rocket into a massive shotgun blast, anti-tank versions with shaped charges capable of penetrating 160 millimeters of armor. The most feared variant was the M30, a 300mm rocket that created a blast crater 10 feet deep and 40 feet across. A single battery of 12 M30 launchers could fire 144 of these monsters in 3 minutes, obliterating fortified positions that conventional artillery would need days to reduce. At the Battle of Kursk in July 1943, the Red Army concentrated over 2,000 Katyusha launchers along the defensive lines. When the German offensive began, entire panzer battalions advanced into pre-registered killing zones and were systematically destroyed by massed rocket fire. German battle reports from Kursk read like nightmare fuel. The Russian rocket fire is overwhelming. Our positions are under constant bombardment. When the fire lifts, their infantry and tanks are already among us. We cannot hold under these conditions. Request permission to withdraw. Permission was usually denied. German commanders understood that retreat under Katyusha fire was even more deadly than holding position. The rockets could saturate road junctions and choke points, turning organized withdrawals into massacres. Let's examine the raw numbers that made the Katyusha terrifying. A standard BM-13 battery consisted of 12 launchers. Each launcher carried 16 rockets. A battery salvo was therefore 192 rockets, each delivering approximately 11 pounds of high explosive. Total explosive delivery over 1 ton, arriving in 10 seconds. For comparison, a German artillery battalion of 12 105mm howitzers, firing as rapidly as possible, could deliver perhaps 40 shells in the same time frame, about 1,500 pounds of high explosive, arriving over several minutes with significant gaps between rounds. The Katyusha delivered roughly the same explosive tonnage in a fraction of the time, with no gaps, no pauses, no opportunity for the enemy to move between rounds. The result was simultaneous detonations across the entire target area, preventing any possibility of finding safe zones. Soviet fire doctrine called for batteries to fire in regimental strength,
when possible. 3 batteries, 36 launchers, 576 rockets, nearly 3 tons of high explosive delivered in seconds. These salvos would systematically walk across German positions in a pattern designed to ensure saturation coverage. The average dispersion of Katyusha salvo at 3,000 meters range was approximately 60 meters laterally and 100 meters in depth. This meant a regimental salvo would blanket an area 180 meters wide and 100 meters deep with explosions. Nothing organic could survive in that kill zone. Infantry were shredded, vehicles were flipped, buildings collapsed. German casualty reports show a pattern. Units hit by Katyusha fire reported disproportionate psychological casualties compared to conventional artillery. Men who could endure hours of howitzer fire would break under a single Katyusha salvo. The sudden, overwhelming nature of the attack bypassed the coping mechanisms soldiers developed for gradual artillery bombardment.
The Katyusha proved particularly effective in winter operations, where German forces were already struggling with logistics and cold. Soviet batteries would set up in forward positions, fire salvos that destroyed German supply columns and heated bunkers, then withdraw before retaliation. At the siege of Leningrad, Katyushas mounted on T-60 light tanks operated within the encircled city, firing at German artillery positions from hidden locations and immediately relocating. The Germans couldn't silence these batteries because they couldn't find them. By the time counter-battery fire arrived, the launchers were gone. During the January 1944 offensive that broke the siege, Soviet forces concentrated 600 Katyusha launchers along a 30-kilometer front. The preliminary bombardment involved 9,600 rockets fired in the opening minutes, followed by waves of infantry and armor attacking through the smoke and confusion. German defenders reported that the bombardment didn't just destroy positions, it destroyed the ability to think clearly. Officers couldn't issue orders over the screaming sound. Radio communications were drowned out. Men huddled in bunkers while the world outside became fire and thunder. General Lieutenant Herbert Gill, commanding the 5th SS Panzer Division at Leningrad, wrote that the Katyusha barrage created a psychological shock that paralyzed our defenders. Even veteran troops who had survived years on the Eastern Front became disoriented and ineffective. The weapon doesn't just kill, it terrorizes. As the Red Army pushed westward in 1944 and 1945, Katyusha batteries became the hammer that broke German defensive lines. Soviet offensive doctrine evolved around the weapon. Mass artillery preparation featuring thousands of conventional guns, followed by Katyusha salvos timed to hit just as Soviet armor and infantry began their assault. The timing was critical. Conventional artillery fire would force German defenders into bunkers and trenches. As soon as that fire lifted, the moment defenders would normally emerge to man their positions, Katyusha rockets would saturate the area. Soviet assault troops would reach German lines while defenders were still reeling from the double bombardment. This tactic was used to devastating effect at the Vistula-Oder offensive in January 1945. The Soviets concentrated over 1,200 Katyusha launchers along the front. When the offensive began, the initial bombardment involved 19,200 rockets fired in the opening salvos, followed by rolling barrages that accompanied Soviet forces as they advanced. German forces attempting to retreat were channeled into kill zones where Katyusha batteries waited. Roads, bridges, and crossroads were pre-registered. As German columns approached, rockets would saturate the area, destroying vehicles and scattering survivors. At the Silo Heights, the final major battle before Berlin, Soviet forces used Katyushas in direct support roles, advancing the launchers to forward positions and firing at German strongpoints from ranges under 1,000 meters.
At these ranges, even the Katyusha's poor accuracy was sufficient. The target areas were so small that dispersion didn't matter. After the war, captured German officers were extensively debriefed about Soviet weapons. The Katyusha generated more discussion than any other system except the T-34 tank. General Oberst Heinz Guderian, in his post-war writings, admitted that the Soviet rocket launchers represented a philosophical approach to warfare that we failed to appreciate. We sought precision and efficiency. They sought overwhelming volume. In a total war, volume proved more valuable. American military observers studying the weapon were initially dismissive. The rockets were inaccurate, the launchers were unarmored, the system was crude, but as they analyzed combat reports and interviewed German veterans, a different picture emerged. The Katyusha succeeded because it embraced simplicity. It could be produced in vast numbers by semi-skilled workers using basic industrial equipment. It could be operated by minimally trained crews. It could be repaired with common tools and simple replacement parts. Most importantly, it couldn't be countered by superior German tactical skill because it didn't engage in tactical exchanges, it simply obliterated areas. Post-war rocket artillery systems around the world owed their existence to the Katyusha. The American M270 MLRS, the Chinese Type 63, the British Land Mattress all traced their conceptual lineage to those simple rails welded to Soviet trucks. Behind the statistics and tactical analyses were humans experiencing the Katyusha from both ends of its trajectory. Soviet crews loved and feared their weapon, loved it because it made the enemy afraid, feared it because ammunition accidents were common, because German forces hunted them relentlessly, because the launcher's distinctive appearance made them priority targets. Lieutenant Dmitry Ivanov commanded a Katyusha battery throughout 1943 and 1944. His diary, published decades after the war, described the constant tension. We knew that firing the launchers revealed our position. Every salvo was followed by frantic reloading and desperate attempts to relocate before German artillery found us. We lost more batteries to counter-battery fire than to direct combat. The weapon made us powerful and vulnerable simultaneously. German soldiers developed various coping mechanisms. Some units began digging deeper bunkers with multiple chambers connected by tunnels, the theory being that rocket impacts would destroy some chambers but not all. Others dispersed their positions so widely that no single salvo could hit multiple units. Many simply prayed they wouldn't hear that sound. Gefreiter Wilhelm Hoffmann, a Wehrmacht infantryman who survived the war, wrote in his memoir about his first Katyusha experience near Kursk. The sound arrived before the rockets, a screaming wail that made your bowels turn to water. Then the impacts, so many you couldn't count them, just a continuous roar of explosions. When it stopped, I crawled out of my hole and saw that my platoon's position had ceased to exist. I was the only survivor. Not because I was brave or lucky, just because I happened to be in the one spot the rockets missed. By the time Soviet forces entered Germany in 1945, Katyusha batteries were attached to every Soviet army and many divisions. The weapon that had been deployed in desperate secrecy in 1941 was now ubiquitous. At the Battle of Berlin, Katyushas fired directly into urban blocks, the rockets detonating against buildings and creating showers of concrete and steel that were as deadly as the explosions themselves. German defenders reported that the sound of Katyusha salvos echoing through city streets was like being inside a bell while it's ringing. The final Katyusha salvos of World War II were fired in Berlin on May 2, 1945, against the last pockets of German resistance near the Reichstag. By that point, the weapon had fired millions of rockets, destroyed thousands of targets, and killed tens of thousands of German soldiers. But more than the physical destruction, the Katyusha had achieved something intangible and profound. It had reversed the psychology of the Eastern Front. In 1941, German soldiers had been confident in their superiority, certain that Soviet weapons were inferior and Soviet tactics were clumsy. The Katyusha taught them that sometimes crude could be effective, that sometimes quantity could overwhelm quality, that sometimes the screaming sound in the distance meant death was already inbound, and there was nothing you could do but hide and pray.
The Soviet Katyusha succeeded because it was designed for the war that actually existed, not the war military theorists imagined. It was built for a nation that needed weapons immediately, that had more raw materials than skilled workers, that valued battlefield effect over elegant engineering. It succeeded because it recognized that in total war, terror is a weapon as powerful as high explosive. The sound of the rockets, that distinctive scream that gave the launcher its name, did as much damage to German morale as the warheads themselves. Most importantly, it succeeded because it could be built, deployed, and used by ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances. Farmers became rocket artillery crews. Teenagers learned to fire weapons that could destroy companies. Factory workers who had never seen a blueprint assembled launchers that changed the course of battles. When Hauptmann Weber crawled out from behind that stone barn near Orsha in July 1941, watching smoke rise from where his unit had been standing moments before, he understood something that German high command would take years to accept. The Eastern Front was going to be different from anything they'd experienced. The enemy had found a way to match German tactical excellence with overwhelming firepower delivered at unprecedented speed. The Germans called it Stalin's organ, because the multiple rails resembled organ pipes, and because Stalin's name on anything Soviet was useful propaganda. But Soviet soldiers knew the real reason for the name. When Little Katie sang, whole German battalions fell silent. 16 rockets in 10 seconds. Simple, crude, devastating. The Katyusha was the sound of industrial warfare played at maximum volume, a weapon designed not to win battles with precision, but to win wars with overwhelming force. And that screaming sound, echoing across the steppes and through German nightmares, was the sound of their certainty dying.